First question in this ANZ matter. How did it all go wrong for ANZ? And what alarm bells should this be sending?
Well, it took place over several years, so it's hard to say what particular event set it off, but it's certainly the case that the APRA, being the banking regulator, was more than aware of problems with what we call risk management at the ANZ Bank from at least 2019 onwards. So none of this is really all that new, but it was essentially, there are two camps here. One is what we call the bond market trading, which is essentially where the government is the person borrowing the money and the bank was acting on behalf of the government. And the second lump of misconduct related to the retail banking side of things. We're more familiar with that because we saw that during the Banking Royal Commission and the disasters that followed from that. But the the concern actually is of the $240 million that they've been required to pay, just under half, $125 million, relates to the bond market issue. And that will sound rather complicated, but it's actually quite important because the rate that the government borrows money at is the rate that it costs us for services and we indirectly pay for through our tax. So every one of us is affected by these actions.
And Helen, the ASIC chairman Joe Longo gave a press conference this morning claiming the government was $26 million worse off as a result of ANZ's conduct in the bond sale and their misleading, deceptive conduct in particular. But ANZ claims the government suffered no financial loss, but it will pay the government the revenue it made as a goodwill gesture. Do you think ANZ is downplaying the severity of the issue?
Well, I think it's very interesting that in their market announcement, they had a totally different attitude to the bond market issues versus the retail banking issues. They did a complete mea culpa on the retail banking issues and said, yes, there's a lot of problems there and we're fixing it up. And definitely we regret that we did what we did. In relation to the bond market issues, they took issue that they insisted they hadn't broken the law. They'd not engaged in what's called market manipulation. And to understand that, I have to give you a little explanation, but that's the key law they were talking about. They also maintained that the government had not lost any money, and obviously that's challenged. But in the actual statement from ASIC, what essentially they were saying was it was serious misconduct, even if we don't necessarily agree. The ANZ doesn't necessarily agree to that amount, and depending on who you read, it could have been upwards to $80 million in additional interest that they were forced to pay because of what took place. Now, this is in fact challenged by the ANZ, we should say that, but there are very, very large questions to be asked about how, if this is a so-called goodwill gesture, even if one puts aside the words, you pay $125 million to a regulator and say that that is not, that's enough and we've explained ourselves. I think there's a lot more to come here.
Yeah, it's a very expensive goodwill gesture, as you put it. Now, it's also interesting, you mentioned that ANZ claims it did not engage in market manipulation in that bond sale. So do you think it's a case that ASIC didn't have enough evidence to prosecute that argument, or it was just too hard to prove and they wanted an easy win?
Well, actually, I wonder if the pressure to settle it came from the ANZ. In a sense, reading the new CEO's comments of recent times, he's very keen to get past these regulatory failings. And I think he has put a lot of effort into getting these things settled. Otherwise, they would have gone to court. And I wonder if in the end, part of it is, look, we're never going to agree, but we'll pay whatever fine you decide to give us because we just want to get rid of it. So it's not so much about an argument as a practical reality. We've got to put this to bed so we can move on.
Wow, whatever fine necessary, almost a blank check there. ANZ... Oh, sorry, go
I
on.
probably shouldn't say it, whatever fines necessary, but what I mean is that there was a real willingness on the part of the ANZ to accept a financial penalty in order to settle this and get rid of it. Now, I think we have much larger questions to ask about whether or not this is in fact adequate, what's going to go ahead and make sure that this doesn't happen again. I guess the practical reality is it seems as though they've lost this business. So at least on one level, we could say there's no risk of it happening again.
So, Helen, the bank also says it's significantly reduced the pay of the current and former executives who are responsible for this wrongdoing. So do you think it's a case of a few bad apples, or are there wider systemic problems within ANZ?
I would argue that there were a wider systemic problems, and a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, it has happened over several years. Secondly, APRA has been constantly going back and forward about this with the ANZ Bank. Thirdly, it isn't just the action of one particular person, it's the action of all the executive in allowing this to go on, including the Chief Risk Officer. So I think the C-suite does due and does owe the public what I refer to as an illustration of collective responsibility, where all of the executives involved have to actually take a cut. And I don't mean even a slight cut. I actually think they should have their bonuses for this particular period cancelled and all clawed back, because we're not talking about a rap on the knuckles. We're talking about a $240 million fine, and that's a lot of money. Why are we allowing anyone to be given an incentive for acting in a way that caused that kind of misconduct or at least penalty to be imposed upon the bank? So yes, in that response, I would say there's a lot to be done. The bank itself says it's had conducted 50 accountability reviews. That meaning, I guess they've gone line by line through all the people involved in this episode. But there is accountability, and it certainly needs to occur. But there's also need to demonstrate to the public that you aren't going to tolerate that kind of behaviour. On that front, I remind the bank of the CBA during the Royal Commission, who was confronted by all sorts of failings to do with money laundering. And Catherine Livingstone, the chair at the time, said all executive bonuses were cut and all directors would not receive fees that year.
All right, bonuses being cut entirely. I'm sure a lot of consumers might be happy with that if that were to happen. And now, my final question to you is, do you have any confidence this won't happen again, Helen, and that ANZ has adequately addressed its problems?
Well, I think there are some concerns. The concerns are slightly echoed by recent statements. For example, the present Chief Risk Officer has been demoted to institution banking. There may well be a replacement coming, but in relation to that, that always sends a very bad sign. Secondly, there has been a large reduction of staff, 3,500. We're getting very limited details of who exactly that is, and risk management is always an area which is first to go because it's considered a cost of doing business. And thirdly, I think that we are looking at behaviours that were encouraged by systems that encouraged you to make as much money as you could for the bank. Now, when you have those systems and they exist in all banks, of course there is a risk it's going to continue. The one saving grace is, as I understand and have said previously, the Commonwealth Government has announced that they won't be asking the ANZ to place their bonds from here on in. So at least in that particular type of conduct, they possibly have reduced capacity to do anything. But really, until they give us very detailed explanations of what they're doing, we can only speculate as to what changes have occurred. I guess that we need to depend on APRA to make sure that they are adequate.